Francis Wade, Myanmar's Enemy Within, Buddhist Violence and the Making of a Muslim Other. Dive into the complexities of Myanmar's Rakhine state, where Buddhist and Muslim communities once coexisted in harmony. Myanmar's Enemy Within unveils how the transition from dictatorship to democracy led to anti-Muslim violence. In the summer of 2012, targeting Rohingya Muslims who viewed themselves as citizens of Myanmar. Explore the origins of this hostility, the role of extremists, the influence of Myanmar's history, and the difficult position faced by the pro-democracy movement to understand the roots and ramifications of the devastating conflict between Buddhists and Muslims in this region.
The causes of anti-Muslim violence in Myanmar. Rakhine State in Myanmar witnessed a transition from dictatorship to democracy between 2011 and 2015, which led to anti-Muslim violence in 2012. The violence was directed at Rohingya Muslims, who are considered outsiders by the Rakhine Buddhist majority. Losing their land and fear of Islamization were the key factors that led to the violence. The shift towards democracy allowed minority groups in Myanmar to assert their rights, causing concern and fear among the Rakhine Buddhists. The roots of the Rohingya crisis. The Rohingya crisis in Myanmar can be attributed to two main factors: the brutal attack on a Buddhist seamstress, which led to violent retaliation against innocent Muslim men, and the spread of a divisive narrative about the Rohingya people. The idea that the Rohingya were illegal immigrants who posed a threat to the Buddhist majority was popularized through Buddhist media and journals, giving extremists a newfound voice to spread their ideas. This escalation was fueled by Myanmar's transition to democracy and open elections, which allowed for the free flow of information and gave extremists the freedom to incite violence against the Rohingya. Myanmar's anti-Muslim violence. In 2012, clashes between Rohingya and Buddhists sparked anti-Muslim violence across Myanmar. Despite evidence of government complicity, Buddhists were portrayed as acting in self-defense while the Rohingya were called terrorists. Leading Rakhine monks called for boycotts of Muslims, and attacks targeted unrelated ethnic groups as well. The violence left thousands in refugee camps and exposed deep-seated prejudice against Muslims in Myanmar. The roots of anti-Muslim resentment in Myanmar. Muslims in Myanmar have a rich history dating back over 1,000 years. However, the British Empire's policies in Myanmar fostered anti-Muslim resentment. In 1885, Britain annexed Myanmar, leading to Indian immigration and a change in the country's demographics. By the 1920s and 30s, Myanmar nationalists aimed to remove both the British authorities and the new arrivals, with a particular focus on Muslim populations. This resentment towards Muslims has since expanded to cover older Muslim populations like the Rohingya. Myanmar's military dictatorship and national unity. Myanmar's military regime aimed to attain national unity at all costs as it believed it was the only way to protect the country from internal and external threats. They claimed that Myanmar had flourished mainly because it was unified behind one culture and faith, Buddhism. The British era witnessed the introduction of alien groups like Muslims, who refused to assimilate, which eroded the country's unity. The military used force to achieve national unity, emphasizing their role was to restore an old nation, not build a new one. Myanmar's narrow definition of citizenship. Myanmar's military regime, after gaining power in 1962, withdrew promises made to minority groups, leading to insurgencies and the regime's best-resourced institution. By the 1970s, the regime narrowed the definition of citizenship and used ethnic identity as a means of national unity. This fixed identity approach was similar to the British, which the regime followed instead of Myanmar's own history of fluid ethnic identity. Ethnic fluidity was seen as a danger to the nation, leading to citizens' ethnicities being listed on ID cards, defining their place in society, and granting or restricting freedoms based on that identity. The ongoing persecution of the Rohingya. The Myanmar government excluded the Rohingya from its index of national races, tying citizenship to ethnic identity, which left the Rohingya without legal standing. This policy follows a pattern of xenophobia and violence towards minority communities by the military dictatorship. Many Rohingya have been left stateless without government identification papers. Myanmar's plan to resettle Buddhists. Myanmar's plan to change the demographics of Rohingya-majority Rakhine State involved the resettlement of Buddhists from the country's interior. In the 1990s, Myanmar's dictatorship approached Buddhist criminals in prison, offering them early release in exchange for relocating to Rakhine State. They were given newly built houses, monthly stipends, food rations, cows, and paddy fields, making it an extraordinarily generous setup in a virtually non-existent welfare state. The goal of the plan was to place Bamar officials and loyal troops in the highest offices in the state and resettle Buddhists, thus strengthening the nation and preventing the region from being lost to the Muslim population whose numbers were being bolstered by Bengali immigrants. Colonel The Kyo, an ethnic Rakhine Buddhist, hatched the idea of resettling Buddhists in Rakhine State and believed that the Rohingya label was part of a conspiracy to allow outsiders to claim the same rights as the indigenous population, which could lead to a large Muslim minority acting as a bridgehead for the Islamization of the country. The Kyo's plan won the government support as they shared the view that Buddhism was the social glue holding the nation together and that Islam was a solvent weakening this bond. The pro-democracy movement's silence. The pro-democracy movement in Myanmar, despite its history of opposing the military regime and championing equality, has remained silent on the Rohingya crisis. Even the movement's leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, has refused to condemn attacks on the group. This can be attributed to the movement's fear of losing support by opposing nationalist movements that depict themselves as defenders of Buddhism.
The book Myanmar's Enemy Within sheds light on the complexities of the conflict between Buddhists and Muslims in Rakhine State, vital to understanding the ongoing crisis faced by Rohingya Muslims. This violence emerged from a culmination of historical, political, and social factors, amplified by the transition from dictatorship to democracy. As Myanmar struggles to find national unity, the pro-democracy movement is caught in a difficult position when it comes to addressing the violent persecution against the Rohingya. The book illustrates the challenges of untangling deep-seated hostilities, the role of extremists in perpetuating the conflict, and the struggle to find a peaceful path forward for a diverse and turbulent nation.